farming and food supply in the U.S. to the famine crisis happening across the globe. Thanks for joining us for this special edition of Faith Nation. From Washington, D.C., I'm Jenna Browder. A hunger crisis not seen in more than 40 years is now ravaging the Horn of Africa. A perfect storm of back-to-back droughts, COVID-19, and fallout from the Ukraine war have combined to create the dire conditions. George Thomas reports from Kenya.
Fatuma Abdi Aluhu has just buried her two sons here on the outskirts of Mogadishu, Somalia. She lays a thorny branch on their graves to protect the bodies from wild animals. Both died from starvation.
I wanted to die before them so they could bury me, but both of them died before me.
Somalia and its neighbors in the Horn of Africa, including Ethiopia and Kenya, are facing unprecedented drought conditions.
We've had 4 failed rains. The drought that we're currently seeing in the Horn of Africa is the worst drought in over 40 years.
On average, one person dies every 48 seconds from hunger in the Horn of Africa.
Because of the drought, many water sources have dried up. Many wells have also dried up.
With crops failing, the United Nations says some 22 million people are at risk of starvation. Many of them farmers who only grow enough food to feed their own families.
People will be forced to flee to look for food. People will have to try and find a way to survive. And obviously this entails very perilous journeys for people who are already marginalized.
Many in the region who rely on livestock for livelihood have seen massive numbers of their animals wiped out.
For example, in northern Kenya, we've lost about 1.5 million heads of livestock. Similarly, in southern Ethiopia, we've lost over 2 million. In Somalia, we even stopped counting.
In Somalia alone, around 8 million people, or half the population, are experiencing crisis hunger levels. 1 in 3 children face chronic malnutrition.
I've been shocked to my core these past few days by the level of pain and suffering we see so many Somalis enduring. Famine is at the door.
Anne Kasambo oversees CBN's offices in Kenya. In partnership with Operation Blessing, they've been distributing food and other aid supplies to some of the hardest hit regions of her country.
It's been quite devastating in some communities, and especially in the arid areas where even when there's rain, food is hard to come by because they're not able to grow their food.
4 consecutive droughts and African economies still reeling from the coronavirus pandemic have created these dire conditions.
As if that was not enough, the situation has been aggravated by the current conflict in Europe between Russia and Ukraine.
Before the war, Somalia imported 90% of its wheat from Russia and Ukraine, while Ethiopia imported 42%. Kenya, which also imports oil, iron, steel, and fertilizers from Russia and Ukraine, imports 44% of its wheat from both countries. All that has come to a screeching halt since war started. The result? Skyrocketing prices for practically everything.
It has really affected us, especially on food prices. It has also affected the cost of fuel.
When the fuel prices go up, the production cost is higher, so everything is affected.
A new survey found most Kenyans are increasingly turning to their savings or taking out loans in order to meet the rising cost of living.
It's been a build-up from COVID to inflation, to drought, to the war in Ukraine. So just before one situation gets better, another one crops up.
In late August, the first ship carrying grain from Ukraine docked on the Horn of Africa, offloading some 2,300 tons of wheat.
That's enough wheat to feed 1.5 million people for about a month.
Food experts say that's a drop in the bucket, considering the immediate crisis facing millions across the Horn of Africa. George Thomas, CBN News, Nairobi, Kenya.
Meatpacking companies making record profits while you're paying more at the grocery store. Find out how cattle ranchers feel about the price gouging next on Faith Nation. Welcome back. 4 major meat packers control 85% of all meat packing in America, and 2 of those are in Brazil. That is a problem for cattle ranchers in the U.S. and a potential threat to our food supply and national security. Winnie Griffith brings us that story from South Dakota.
Here in South Dakota, there are about 5 cows for every person. That's a lot of beef. And cattle ranchers say the problem isn't getting the meat to your plate. Is the fact that the meat packers are taking most of the profits.
There's 4 beef packers that control 85% of all the slaughter in the United States. These 4 beef packers are recording profits of anywhere from $1,200 to as high as $2,000 a head during the pandemic, where the rancher is at a break even to even a loss.
Les Shaw is a 4th-generation cattle rancher in White Owl, South Dakota.
We don't do this to get rich. We do this because we love it. We're proud of what my great-grandfather, my grandfather, and my dad handed down to us, and there's nothing that would make me happier to be able to pass this on to my kids, my 2 girls.
Shaw admits, though, it's getting much harder to make a living raising beef cattle because of a monopoly created by 4 major meat packers, 2 in the U.S. and 2 in Brazil.
The Brazilians have a hold in this market. Our country let foreign investment into this country.
The 4 major meat packers are Tyson Foods, Cargill, and 2 Brazilian-owned corporations, National Beef Packing and JBS. In 1977, the Big 4, as they're commonly called, owned just 25% of the market. Today, that's exploded to 85% of all meat packing in America. Cattle ranchers used to receive 62 cents for every consumer dollar spent on beef. Today, that's dropped to less than 37 cents on the dollar, while the Big 4 have tripled profits in the past 2 years alone. The Ranchers Cattlemen Action Legal Fund is suing the 4 companies over accusations of manipulating prices.
We've alleged that they have conspired to artificially depress prices paid to U.S. cattle producers while simultaneously inflating the price of beef that consumers pay.
Bill Bullard, head of the legal fund, says the main problem is that ranchers aren't told what price they'll receive for their cattle until after it's delivered to the packers.
This itself is anti-competitive, and it has helped to purge competition from throughout the entire supply chain. So the solution has to be to restore competitive forces to the marketplace. And you do that by forcing the packers to begin competing competitively for cattle.
During a congressional hearing in April, CEOs of the 4 packers denied any price fixing and blamed the rising beef prices on simple supply and demand. South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem, a rancher herself, isn't buying it. She says food security is national security.
The country that feeds itself controls its own future. But if we start importing food from another country, then they control us. And we are getting dangerously close to that. And we're seeing supply chain issues. We're seeing other countries heavily investing in our food processing systems that is dangerous for the people that live in the United States of America.
So anytime there's a supply chain disruption, retail prices go up, the packers make record profit, and the producer suffers the consequences.
Noem recently appointed Lieutenant Governor Larry Roden, another lifelong rancher, as agriculture ambassador to focus more on helping the smaller meat packers in South Dakota.
99 of our small processing plants receive grant money. I tour them every chance I get. In addition to that, we applied for and became part of the CIS, which is Cooperative Interstate Shipment, which allows our local processors to sell across state lines, just like they were federally inspected.
Roden says the government needs to investigate the practices of those 4 meatpacking operations and break up the monopoly.
Because we have a law in the books at the federal level since 1947, it was called the Packers and Stockyards Act, which has been ignored largely, and we were doing the investigation. That's all been put on hold.
Bullard says if competition isn't restored soon, it will have dire consequences for cattle ranchers.
It's extremely serious. If we don't take some immediate corrective actions, this industry will no longer look like what it does today. We've already lost 75% of their marketing outlets, which we call feedlots in the industry, the entity that feeds the animal for the last 2 or 3 months before it's actually harvested. And so cattle producers are finding it difficult to market their cattle. even at the time when beef demand and beef exports are extremely high.
As ranchers themselves, Governor Noem and Lieutenant Governor Roden say they bring a crucial understanding to this issue, and that's comforting to Shaw and others like him.
It's a unique point right here that the Lieutenant Governor, like I told you earlier, I grew up with him. He's somewhat of a neighbor. Their door is always open.
Despite the challenges, Shaw says he remains optimistic about the future, mainly because of his Christian faith.
There's good times ahead. This is just a cycle, and it's up to us. I pray for strong men and strong women to step forward and not be silent, take action, do what's right, and make changes. So there is a future for this business and our kids and the next generation, so this heritage doesn't disappear.
Wendy Griffith, CBN News, White Owl, South Dakota.
Dutch farmers take up the fight. How they say their government is using climate change to take their land. And the concern could happen in America after this. In the Netherlands, farmers are taking their tractors out of fields and into the streets. They're protesting a government plan to shrink their farms and take their land, all in the name of climate change. Dale Hurd explains how what's unfolding there could soon happen here at home.
The most efficient system in history of growing food and getting it to consumers, modern farming, is under attack, blamed for causing climate change. The world has watched as Dutch farmers fight for their economic survival against demands that they shrink their operations to suit the government's climate change agenda. The government has told farmers to cut ammonia emissions by 50%, and those near protected areas must reduce their operations by as much as 95%. Or they must sell their land to the government and face a lifetime ban from farming. Farmers responded by spraying government buildings with manure, and police shot at this 16-year-old boy. Jos Ubels, vice president of the Farmers Defense Force in the Netherlands, tells us negotiations are not going anywhere, and a bad situation is continuing to escalate.
We are fighting for our rights to produce and to live as a human being in our country, in a democracy, where we have the right to go on the street to protest against legislations. And we have the right to produce via our permits. If you check our production rates and how we work, we produce very high level, very high scale, good healthy food, traceable, all with a little environmental impact.
Farmers around the world who are also seeing their way of life under attack have demonstrated in solidarity.
American farmers who are already subject to a host of regulations could face even more restrictions. But politicians should view what happened in Sri Lanka as a cautionary tale.
Sri Lanka's ban of chemical fertilizers in farming caused the struggling nation's agricultural sector and then its economy to collapse. It ended with protesters frolicking in the presidential swimming pool after the nation's leader fled the country. Sri Lanka was supposed to be the poster child of modern organic farming. The World Economic Forum even proudly posted this article about Sri Lanka's future success, written by the Prime Minister whose house was set on fire by protesters. Parts of the world already face famine because of a shortage of chemical fertilizer due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The same kind of fertilizer environmentalists want to reduce. Washington attorney Gary Bass, who helped start the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970, and now says it should be abolished because it's Orwellian, owns 11 farms in Illinois. He calls what the Dutch government is trying to do to its farming sector madness, and sees signs a similar movement is coming to the U.S.
Agriculture is an easy target, both from the animal standpoint and from guys like me who put a lot of anhydrous ammonia on their corn crop. They're going after methane. Which is belched by cows. AOC has it wrong. They do not FART, the methane, they belch it.
Bass believes the era of cheap food at the grocery store is over, not just from inflation, but because of growing environmental regulations on farming. and says Sri Lanka should be a warning to leaders who want to experiment with food production.
That's what happens when you don't have food.
Nevertheless, the Biden administration appears to be coming after farmers. Steve Malloy, editor of the website junkscience.com, writes that a new study by the EPA claims that farm dust kills 17,000 Americans per year, the same EPA standards that basically killed the coal industry.
These are people who want to control every aspect of our lives, and that includes energy production and use and food use. They believe food production is a major contributor to, global warming. They're not going to give up on agriculture. They don't like agriculture.
Former U.S. Ambassador to the Netherlands, Piet Hoekstra, says if the Dutch government wins this battle against its farmers, who are the second largest exporters of agricultural products in the world behind the United States, it will only make the global food shortage worse.
The Dutch will not experience food shortages, but there may be other parts of the world that will, because this food is going to go away.
Any government willing to risk its food supply in order to fight climate change might want to keep Sri Lanka in mind. Dale Hurd, CBN News.
Well, 1/3 of every bite you eat at the dinner table, you can thank bees for, the backyard beekeepers who cultivate them. That story when Faith Nation returns. Well, it's probably something we don't think about often, but 1/3 of every bite we take at the dinner table is made possible by the pollination of honeybees, crucial to our food supply. And that makes the growing trend of backyard beekeeping much more than just a hobby. Mark Martin braved the bees to bring us this next story.
There's probably about 1,500 bees on this particular frame.
Virginia master beekeeper Haji Holgerson began this work close to 60 years ago after reading a book on honeybees in elementary school.
I probably spend more time doing this than I do my day job. Don't tell my boss, but anyway.
Today he cares for about 100 hives and is a member of the Tidewater Beekeepers Association.
To educate not only beekeepers, but the non-beekeeping public. And educating the non-beekeeping public is a daunting task because most people are afraid of honeybees.
If you're a backyard beekeeper, this is what you want to see. A healthy colony has a nice oval pattern with young, undeveloped bees covering about 75% of the frame, the rest being pollen and honey. And while delicious honey is a good reason to keep bees around, Holgerson says their main contribution is pollination.
Virginia's #1 economy is agriculture. Virginia farmers raise 100 different commercially grown crops that they would not be able to raise if it wasn't for a simple bug. That kind of puts things in perspective.
Keith Tignor echoes that importance, pointing to the bees' role in producing the quantities of our fruits, vegetables, and nuts we have today.
It's been estimated that 1/3 of every bite we take at the dinner table is attributed to pollination by the honeybee. Without honeybees, the cost of food is going to continue to increase. The availability of food is going to decrease. And so it's extremely critical to maintain a healthy honeybee population for that pollination.
In Massachusetts, 6th-generation beekeeper Ken Warchaw has strived to maintain healthy bees for nearly 70 years.
There's nothing better I love to do than to go into a beehive. It's so rewarding, so refreshing, so relaxing.
Ken describes this hive as being very healthy, but the odds are stacked against honeybees. He says on average each year he sees 20 to 25% losses. And believe it or not, for a beekeeper, that's a good percentage.
Here in the United States, it rings between 35 and 60%, depending what areas. The northern latitudes a little more because down south they can raise brood all year round. Up here, they cut their brood rearing off in November and start up in January. And so it's many more losses up here than down south, more like 35% down south, more like 50 to 60% up here.
We have an annual loss of approximately 30%. That's each winter we anticipate that we're going to lose 1/3 of our population. Virginia is not alone in the loss of bees. Some locations are even greater losses than us. Some are doing a little bit better. But overall, this is a problem that's worldwide.
Beekeepers say a number of factors continue to affect the population, like pesticides, poor nutrition, disease, and pests like the varroa mite.
The diseases, pests that are being introduced almost on an annual basis into the United States that is causing problems for honeybees and other pollinators.
This is what's called an observation hive. Tignor takes it to schools, garden clubs, festivals, places where people are interested in honeybees. If you'd like to become a backyard beekeeper, he recommends that you first educate yourself on managing bees.
We do need more numbers of bees out there for pollination. That it is a good thing. It's a positive thing. And as I mentioned earlier, as long as they're responsible beekeepers, we call them beekeepers and not bee havers. Take care, make sure they stay alive and continue to prosper as opposed to just leaving them alone, because without your help, those bees aren't going to survive with those factors all against them.
Experts we interviewed acknowledge that even with the work of beekeepers, the overall bee population faces an uphill battle in terms of maintaining numbers. Mark Martin, CBN News.
And we're grateful for those beekeepers and the bees, and we're grateful for you as well. Thank you for joining us. Have a great night.